Welcome to SAIS's Rethinking Iran initiative, and we're very excited to kick off this semester's programming with our event for today. I'm Narges Pajogli. I'm an assistant professor here at SAIS, and I'm joined by my colleague, Professor Vadi Nast. As we were brainstorming about the types of events that we wanted to feature for this semester, especially taken in light with everything that has been going on with the uprisings in Iran, we thought that there was no one better to sort of have this conversation with and to help us understand what is happening in Iran and in relation to the rest of the Middle East than our guest for today, Professor ASEF BAYAT. Dr. ASEF BAYAT is a professor of sociology and the Catherine and Bruce Bastian Professor of Global and Transnational Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Before joining Illinois, he taught at the American University of Cairo for many years and served as the director of the International Institute for the Study of Islam in the Modern World, holding the chair of Society and Culture of the Modern Middle East at Leiden University in the Netherlands. His research areas range from social movements and social change to religion and public life, urban space, and politics of the contemporary Middle East. He's the author of numerous very important books, including, especially relevant for today's conversations, Revolution Without Revolutionaries, which was published, I believe, in 2017 by Stanford University Press, and Revolutionary Life, the Everyday of the Arab Spring, which was published in 2021 by Harvard University Press. I want to welcome you, Professor Bayat, to this conversation. And I also want to let the audience members know that if you have any questions, please put them in the YouTube chat box, and we will try to get to your questions towards the end of the event after our conversation with Professor Bayat today. So I want to start us off, Professor Bayat, with you had a really key interview with Etemad newspaper in Tehran in October of 2022. So a few weeks after the uprisings in Iran began, after the death of Gina Mahsa Amini. And in that, you mentioned that you were seeing a new Iran being born in this uprisings, and that new Iranian subjectivities were coming about given the centering of women in this uprising itself. Now about 4 or 5 months have passed since that interview, and we know that you have a new essay actually coming out in Zaytun today. So we're all looking forward to reading that. But I would love to know, how has your analysis changed, if at all, since October of 2022, and how do you see this uprising that has developed over the past few months?
Thank you so much for having me in this conversation, and thank you both for initiating this conversation, which is, I think, really important in the current sort of political atmosphere, both inside Iran and outside. Well, I mean, 3-4 months really has passed. The key things that has really happened is that the kind of street protests or street politics that used to be the hallmark of the movement, at least in the everyday basis and visibly, certainly it has died down. I think it's important to talk about what is the meaning of this. Is it the end of the whole thing, or is it part of what I would call kind of this cycle of sort of contention in the Iranian context? And I don't think that this is necessarily over. In the social movement theory, we have this notion of exhaustion that happens with respect to the activists, but also what the authorities have done in terms of extending, real, I think, a crackdown on the part of the activists on the streets. But of course, aspects of the protests really have continued. So this is one aspect of it. The initial, of course, sort of manifestation or somewhat the marker of the movement was the centrality of women, right? Both as a subject of sort of transformation, that is the actors of change. Also the women question as a sort of central point, and the concerns of many constituencies that participated in that uprising. And I think that what has happened since that, the concerns and the preoccupation with what we want and who is involved, I think has transcended merely from women, especially hijab. It has, I think, moved into different other constituencies, including, of course, the students and the professionals, and not to mention of ethnicities in the country, as well as segments of the workers and even shopkeepers and so on and so forth. That in the past, for a month, a number of them really collectively did participate. So I think so the issue has become a kind of a national issue that seems to be moving towards a common sort of demand that we want to go beyond the current system. And I think part of the opinion polls that have been conducted both in Iran by the, I think, authorities themselves, which was leaked at some point, and also the opinion poll that has been conducted outside actually does show that the majority of the population, about 80% or so, in fact, support the uprising, that asking for a transformation. And in this process, of course, the political, I think, organization and political parties within the country, within Iran, mostly reformists, have also really moved. When I was doing my E'timad interview, I was somewhat sort of critical of their position as to what they want to do as reformists. Suppose that if this movement continues and reaches a kind of a critical point, what their positions really would be. In some way, it was both an observation, a question to reformists, but also, if I may say, it was some kind of a push also. Okay, what do you think? What is going to happen, and what will you do when things develop towards a kind of a more critical, perhaps, trajectory? And I think since then, a lot of them have been critical, and a lot of the statements, both individuals and organizations. And of course, the latest have been the statement by Mr. Mir Hossein Mousavi, which I think is very significant development.
One of the key questions that you seem to grapple with in your writing, especially as you think through what's happened in the Arab Spring uprisings, and in general, the way that I read how you write about sort of social movements in the 21st century, is you have this core question, which is what's happened over the course of the past 3 to 4 decades that have altered the nature of radical politics in the Middle East, but potentially even more broadly. So you write a lot and think a lot about the revolution of 1979 in Iran, then the uprisings that happened from the Iranian Green Movement to the Arab Spring, and then now the uprisings again in Iran. And part of your critique of some of these movements of the 21st century is that although they are radical rhetorically, part of what sets them apart from what happened in the late 20th century with all of the revolutionary movements is that today's movements are not anchored in strategic visions or concrete programs for the future. Part of that may come about, you write in your work, and other scholars of social movements today write about, which is the social media environment we're in, which allows for these movements to spread so incredibly quickly and for people to come out onto the streets quickly. But what that does is that it does not allow for the infrastructure of movement building that movements necessitated in the pre-social media environment, which meant that they had to have a program, have a strategy to be able to convince others to eventually lead to massive street protests. Today, we kind of have the inverse of all of that. We have the massive street protests, but we don't have the infrastructure building of movements. And so what that means, and you write about this in your Revolution Without Revolutionaries book, that in this process, the state has actually gotten better at surveilling, has gotten better at seeing the different discourses that are developing among activists and protesters, and they are better able to completely repress many of these things in the aftermath of which they happen. And so I would love to know how you're seeing these develop. Potentially the Iranian uprisings of today are the version 2.0 of the early 2009 and 2010 and 11 uprisings in the Middle East. So do you see a shift in this decade in social movement and the way in which it's taking place among young people especially, but also others, and then the capacity of the state to repress so violently?
Yeah, so again, it is very interesting, as we were discussing before, that because we are discussing a movement that is ongoing, and it is ongoing in the aftermath of a series of uprisings that we have seen in the past decade, right? And what is interesting to me, at least, is that it is very difficult to say, despite the similarities that I explained between Iran and the Arab Spring, precisely because what's happening in Iran is occurring after what has occurred there, then the consequence might be different. The outcome might be different. Because revolutions by nature is so incredibly international. And so the very fact that we are talking about this, right? The very fact that we are talking about the possible outcome of the, for instance, what is happening in Iran, might actually change somewhat the trajectory if we hadn't talked about it. You see what I mean? So yes, there are, I think, certain really structural similarities in the current juncture between Iran and the Arab Spring, and indeed, I think between the Middle East and a lot of countries of Global South as well. So it is a kind of a peculiar or particular sort of episode that has developed after the end of the Cold War, when there was a dramatic shift, in this time of post-socialist, post-nationalist, and post-Islamist and post-Cold War era, a dramatic shift towards a kind of politics that somehow disavow the very notion of revolution. It was a period of, indeed, post-revolution, post-idea of revolution. And yet, of course, revolutions, as I write in the book, happen irrespective of what we think about and what we talk about. It can happen. And so what is the peculiarities of this juncture? I think this sort of, as I said, post-Cold War era has occasioned the coincidence of three happenings. One is the a growing restructuring of the economies in the world, global south, global north, more towards marketization and what is called neoliberalization. That has, I think, led to growing inequality in different countries. That includes Iran, Middle East, and other countries as well. And as well as in the countries of global north. Staggering, indeed, inequalities. This is number one. That, of course, that instigates a lot of anger on the part of those people who feel that they are excluded. The second is the emergence of a large, educated, and yet educated and aware, and yet sort of precarious class that itself has been the product of changes and development in the educational sector, many universities, many students graduating and so on, but not finding a job in the labor market. It has been dominated by the policies of marketization that I mentioned earlier. And indeed, this is, to me, a very interesting and very important and politically charged class, which I have called a middle class poor in the context of the countries like ours. And that is a class that has educational capital and has, by and large, middle class dream and a dream of middle class consumption and awareness of what is going on. But at the same time, economically living somewhat the life of the traditional poor, often in squatter settlements, in shantytown areas. I mean, if you look at it, Tunisia is an incredible manifestation of this. So is, of course, in Egypt and so on. And in fact, in Iran, this class emerged much later than in other countries of the Middle East that I was observing. And I think, so this class is very angry and demands, fundamental change. And the third is what you said, that the emergence of new information and technologies and social media and so on and so forth, that has really eased in some way protest and mobilization. That in the course of a short span of time, they are able to mobilize a large number of people, but without really the kind of traditional organization, vision, and what really we want, for the future, by and large, have been kind of missing or very convoluted. So we see in the context of the Middle East, especially in the context of the Arab Spring that we are now talking in retrospect, is that there occurred a kind of a division, a rift between what the political class was thinking, that basically had taken the market and inequality and by and large neoliberalism for granted, whether they were Islamist or liberal or others. Even UJTT in Tunisia by and large took marketization and so on for granted. And then there is the by and large the poor and the subaltern groups, in particular the regional poor of urban and the rural, through their practices, through their action, they seem to actually signal for a more fundamental transformation. So there is this rift, there is this really division. And precisely, I think, this division And the fact that by and large, the political class did not, in my view, address and resolve the question, what I call the political question of transformation of the state and its institutions, and bringing about really new institutions that in more in line with the demand and the desire of the revolutionaries, democratization, for instance, and true representation. And also, even more than that, basically ignoring the social question of basically social justice. And that has led, I think, to a disenchantment of democracy and representation and politicians and politics as such, so that in the first year even of the Tunisian revolution, we see there is incredible disenchantment. And then, of course, opens the way for the emergence of the populists like Al-Qais, and we see what happened, that he staged a constitutional coup, as we know, and so forth. So this is, I think these are the things that somewhat Iran situation also shares. Structurally, I think there are similarities, but in terms of political vision and organization, and so on, this is something that the Iranian movement, Zan Zendegi Azadi, in fact, they are thinking about it. I think in the case of perhaps a lot of Arab revolution, it wasn't even time. It was so rapid. Just imagine within 1 month, a dictator is abdicated, is gone. Sometimes 18 days, right? In different countries. But here, in the case of Iran, I think there is time. And we know that a lot of people who are involved in the movement have begun to speak about the future, about leadership, about organization, and so on. And consequently, if it is successful, then to forge some degree of some kind of leadership organization and a vision, then the outcome could be different. In other words, what happened a decade ago in the countries of the region is not necessarily a destiny, because people learn from each other, as much as, of course, the rulers also learn from each other, try to how to respond to the movements.
Vanya, I'll let you come in with any questions.
Sure. Thank you very much for this very fascinating conversation. I mean, it brings to mind a lot of questions. Nargis earlier on said that this event happened after the protest in Iran happened after Arab Spring, but at some point I would like you to also comment whether they are also happening before another Arab Spring. In the sense that I would like you to see you probe this idea that 2009 in Iran happened before 2011, and we sort of have the same kind of a young, frustrated, poor demography in the region. Of course, issues between countries are different, but to the extent to which we can also think about these things as a sort of at a regional level, that this is a region that is caught in sort of this cycle of social uprisings, and they may feed on one another. Listening to you, a question that came to my mind is to what extent it might be a scenario with what we are seeing in Iran of basically now persistent, endless protest. I mean, in some ways, this, we could argue, started really in 2018, 2019. There were protests. Of course, the language, et cetera, was different. But for the first time, they spread across many cities. It may have included similar demographics. It was not specifically the gender issue that brought them out. But even though we may think about exhaustion, it seems like this fertile ground for this to just sort of continue. And is this sense something new, like a situation in which you just have continuous ongoing protest in society, and necessarily you don't have what happened in Arab Spring, let's say, that you have a very clear end, either with regime collapse or coup or clampdown, but something that comes to my mind, and I welcome your thoughts, that I just don't see ways in which the current government in Iran can actually really fundamentally address what people brought by, neither on the hijab issue, nor on social political freedoms, nor on economic issues, as we see, and that this may just go on for a while.
No, that's a great question. So yes, we have seen, of course, cycles of protests since 2008, right? At least, right? And it has continued. In particular, what was it? 2017 and 2019, correct? What I want to, first of all, if we take this social movement, the notion of cycles of contention, the idea is that the contention can actually lead to other contention, because it opens the opportunity for sort of new grievances and new constituencies, but also in the process, it kind of the repertoire of it, that is the way in which they try to do the movement, to push the movement forward, can actually get enriched, because they are looking for new ways of, new ways of challenging the authorities or the other side. And I think there is something, I think, important in this notion. And I think somewhat it has been reflected, I think, in the context of Iran since 2008. But what I want also to emphasize is that despite the fact that we've seen, these cycles of protests, the nature of them have not been the same. They have different. Their constituency have been different. It is famously said that, for instance, the Green Movement of 2008, as far as I'm concerned, that was, I think, a popular reaction against the Nizam Velayi, or the Velayat Faqih sort of faction in the Iranian government, to actually, to get rid of a reform project, right? So they did it, in fact. So the movement largely was as it is often said, a mostly urban, modern middle classes, although other constituencies and in some degree in the rural areas also they were involved. But the core of it was really a kind of a democracy movement, but within the context of the existing structure, right? Within the existing structure. But then the uprisings later in 2019 was very interesting in the sense that you had several sort of constituencies involved demanding particular sectoral things: peasants for the water, workers for delayed wages, malbakhtagan, all those people who had creditors who had lost their money, and so forth. Fascinatingly, they happened in the course of 10 days, but they were voicing their own sectoral interests, that were connected, however, together through, by and large, social media. And I think if this had occurred, say, I don't know, 50 years ago, it wouldn't have been the kind of uprising that we would see as a kind of a national uprising. It is only the current technology, social media or social networking that is able to somewhat connect the non-collective actors. At the time, of course, some people argue that this is the prelude to revolution, but certainly it wasn't, because there was not a united really people at the time. There were parallel struggle in a particular course of time that, as I said, the new technology made possible. And then 2 years later, there is again another uprising that instigated or triggered by an explicitly economic issue of 200% rise in the price of gasoline, that brought, again, the lower classes and lower middle classes, as well as middle class poor, which actually showed a good degree of unity. Now, this time, however, the situation to me is quite different. First of all, in terms of the variety of constituencies that have been involved, right? That is not just the poor and middle class poor, but also well-off classes, but also especially women, the minorities, the ethnicities. And it is a national movement. It is a national movement that have come together to constitute the people, in that basically these different constituencies, men and women, have come to see this Mahsa Amini as embodiment of the suffering that they have endured in their own lives, in terms of the young people who have not really experienced youthfulness, right? Or the people in Balochistan or in Kurdistan who feel that they have been basically marginalized, even some of them called colonized, and not to mention women, that they feel that internally really their life world have been colonized by this nizam, this system. So there is a collective pain or dard mushtarak that has been that has kind of emerged, and that I think strategically differentiates this current movement from the previous ones. In other words, in this context, it seems that a lot of women have ceased to be women, youth have ceased to be youth, or peasants have used to be peasants, but they all merge into one greater whole, the people, right? And I think this was achieved in particular in the context of, for instance, Egyptian revolution, with the notion of Sha'b emerged, yeah? So in other words, constituencies transcend their sectoral interests in favor of a greater good. And that is the magic of, I think, a revolution, I think. And at least in the, to bring everyone together. And I think this is, it is this factor that makes the current, I think, uprising a revolutionary uprising. In this sense, it is revolutionary and is different. It can continue, as you're saying, the protests might continue back and forth and so forth. But what I say is this, that this revolutionary خیزش انقلابی or revolutionary movement, which basically asking for now basically transformation, structural transformation, can cause what I've called revolutionary course, by which I mean that a large segment of society continues to think a kind of a different future, continues to think that, inar Aftanian, what I mean, these people will go. They continue to think in terms of a radical transformation. And it generates a particular political psychology that changes will come, but we don't know when. Yeah, I think that generates a particular momentum, within the society, that cycles of calm and contention can occur intervally. A few months, calm, a few months contention, and so on. That could lead potentially into what is called a revolutionary situation. What can, I think, change this would be perhaps a very significant intervention on the part of the state to a radical reform, change in the constitution, or referendum, or a massive kind of social and economic programs that kind of gives incentive to people to somewhat be happy with the status quo. Otherwise, I think the alternative is either a state of constant, as you say, constant protest and or I would say ungovernability, yeah, and even possible, depends upon how the state does, implosion, or change into a direction towards a revolutionary situation, in a sense of dual power and so on and so forth. So these are, I think, the possibility can take place. But again, that is very much also depend upon what the state kind of regime's response really will be. So far, there is no sign of really any reform, any change in policies at all. So in the absence of that, I could see those trajectories.
Fascinating. If you don't mind, I follow up with
Yes,
another question. I mean, the more you speak, the more questions open up in my mind, which is fantastic. So, what you said is actually very interesting in this notion of the sort of sense of inevitability of victory. What you said in Urbana-Champaign, and these people will ultimately go, which itself becomes.
I'm not saying it, right?
No. I mean that people are saying it. People are saying it. Yes, it's become a very clear motto there that there's going to be a victory at the end, and that this itself basically generates energy, enthusiasm, and sustainability for a social movement. Now, it's been a question for me, particularly since the Mahsa Amini protests started, that obviously these protests and protests of this size are always in the minds of maybe the people in Iran, but definitely a lot of the critiques outside is always under the overhang of the Iranian Revolution of 79, right? In other words, the reference points is there. The Shah ultimately did go, and the social movement was successful. On the other hand, you worked on Egypt, for instance, where the sense of inevitability is not the same, or in the Arab world. In other words, there's not an expectation that actually a social movement would succeed, because the example of it is so rare. Although Mubarak did go and Ben Ali did go. So I would love for you to hear your thoughts about sort of a comparison of the sustainability of the social movements that you've seen in the Arab world and in Iran based on this expectation. It's very much, I think that perhaps the Islamic Republic is a lot more like the Assad regime than it is like the Shah's regime when it comes to packing up their bags and living in an orderly fashion. So I would definitely welcome your thoughts on that. The second issue, and basically reading also, again, as a comparison with the Arab world, reading your book, it's a question that emerges as to whether poverty is a boost for social movements or is an impediment to success of the social movements. As we often think that, the poorer people get, the more they may revolt. But, if we took the case of Egyptians, Iranians, is that sort of that poverty of the subaltern class itself also a shackle around the ability of the movement to succeed? Anyways, I'll leave you with those two questions, please.
Sure, thank you so much. Yes. So, in fact, I would say that the current moment in Iran is very different from the just pre-revolutionary Arab world. Most familiar with perhaps Egypt and Tunisia. In fact, at the time that they began their first step, I don't think that they were thinking of in terms of regime change. It really happened. As I say, revolutions happens, right? And in the context of the Arab, in the context of Tunisia, I don't want to go through the whole thing, but of course it was self-immolation and then mobilization in the provinces and so on that eventually moved towards the north. But at the beginning, necessarily there wasn't a vision that this will, things will go away, especially at the in terms of political classes. But in the process, however, a lot of activists found themselves the possibility of basically dramatic change, that Erhal, Ben Ali should go. Yeah. In the context of Egypt, as we know, by and large, it was initially the protest for the brutality of the police, what had happened to Khaled Said. And necessarily there wasn't an expectation on the part of a lot of activists that many people would show up, but actually many people did show up. And I think that really surprised a lot of activists themselves that they were not expecting. So, and that is, I think, part of the nature of the new mode of mobilization, that the outcome goes far beyond the expectations, right? And that is very fascinating. So you want to mobilize people, a few thousand to come, and then tens of thousands of people come onto the street. And then the question is, what do you do with these people? What do we want? Yeah. And consequently, there is an improvisation, and the rethinking, and what do we want? What is our vision, and so on and so forth. In the context, I think, Iran today, after now, 5 months or so, I think there is this sentiments, strong sentiments, that we want to go beyond the current system. If those surveys and opinion polls are correct, so that there's a big, of course, difference, because it has lasted, and there's conversation. So that's, I think, a big difference between the two. Poor people, I think poverty does not necessarily, as such, poverty does not necessarily lead to rebellion. is, of course, not only poverty, but also perception of poverty, who is responsible for it, and so on, yeah? And so how you read poverty, that matters. But at least in my own work of working with the poor and their politics, it seems to me that both in the case of Iran and in other countries that have done some research, it shows that abject poor often wait to see what happens. By abject poor, I mean, those poor segment of the population who are immigrants, a lot of them are illiterate, and they constantly involved in making the ends meet. However, in the context of the current movements since the past decade or so, as I mentioned, middle-class poor plays very significant part, because there is this experience of poverty, but at the same time, awareness of deprivation. I think that pushes them into becoming a significant agent.
Before I get to the audience Q&A, I did want to have a question for you, Professor Bayat, which is, as you're talking about the space to create sort of ideas for what a future transformation outside of this state or beyond this state or new sort of state formations looks like in a space like Iran. One of the things that, because I study propaganda, I'm paying a lot of attention to in this uprising, which is very different from the 2009 uprising or even the Arab Spring uprisings, is the way in which special interest groups, cyber armies of states themselves, as well as others outside, are heavily involved in manipulating the discourse of what is happening, right? And presenting new forms of discourse of what the social movement means or what its demands are, or even the polling that is happening, some of which is real polling, some of which is sort of more social media, Instagram polling, but then it becomes a reality in and of itself. And of course, fake news and all of these things are not new. They've been around for a long time, but because of the way in which our social media is organized, and because of this position that Iran has in the Middle East, as well as, if we look at Syria in the past, or if we look at other social movements, we sort of see the same thing. But the question I have for you is, as you are speaking about how this time is different because various constituencies are involved and it's a national kind of uprising, and that there is space, as you say, in contradistinction with the Arab Spring of 10 years ago, to build ideas and strategy for what comes next. How does this highly manipulated social media milieu, which has come to overtake so much of our discourse, impact that, in the sense that, for example, if you're just looking at social media from the outside, Reza Pahlavi is about to take power in Iran relatively soon. If you look at a different algorithm of the social media, a whole different discourse is available. Yet nonetheless, all of these are creating certain realities. And then you also have the situation, and one of the audience members is asking this, so I'm going to tack it on as we're, with just a few minutes left, is how do we think about building these strategies for change in an environment that is highly repressive on the inside, as the Islamic Republic gets even more and more repressive, and in an environment of even more economic precarity due to their own economic mismanagement and increased sanctions, and in an environment of extreme manipulation on the social media front that is both driven by the Iranian state as well as special interest groups in other states that are against the Islamic Republic. So how, in this it feels like we're in a matrix sort of trying to fight these different things. And so how do you see this sort of coming about, which is so different from even a decade ago?
No, this is really absolutely critical question. And I think, and also challenge for the movement currently. One thing I would like to say is that both in the Arab Spring and today, although social media played a very significant part, indeed, was crucial in connectivity and mobilization and so on. But it was really not just social media. There was a lot of activities on the ground in neighborhoods and so forth. And so that's, I think, important to recognize. But you can still say there is still significant influence that social media has, right? As a means of communication and production of discourse, as well as means of mobilization. So what shall we do really here? I think it's crucial. Look, I mean, on the one hand, on the one hand, social media really matters and is so important in the context of a situation where repression really doesn't allow other form of offline mobilization and organization and so on. It has certainly advantages, and it has, I think, played a significant role. I'm talking really about inside the country, inside Iran. It's been incredibly important, and that's why, the regime is trying to, cancel it, put it down, and stop it. But on the other hand, I think that social media mobilization, or so-called networked movement, suffers from the kind of things that you already mentioned. And I think this has to be addressed. Now, in the context of Iran, it is extremely important that some kind of leadership organization to be constructed. I mean, it is really a necessity. Precisely because if you leave it merely to this horizontal and dispersed and parallel kind of forms of mobilization and activism, despite their own advantages, it can lead to really, I think, it can lead to dangerous consequences, because a movement needs responsibility, I think, and that's really crucial. Crucial to ask who is responsible for the movement, who can speak for the movement. I know that there are, of course, now discussions say, well, we don't need anybody to speak for the movement and so on. I think I differ from such perspectives. I think there is a need. It doesn't have to be one person or something. A committee, an organization, and I think building, organization matters. I don't know how you do it, but it is certainly a necessity. And I think that differentiates what happened in Sudan, right? In Sudan and in other countries. In Sudan, there was a really coalition. There was a coalition of various forces, oppositional forces, traditional, modern, left, liberal, all of them. And they managed to come under the umbrella of forces of freedom and change. Yeah, that was led largely by Sudan's Professionals Association, which has had a long history of mobilization and organization that linked, these organizations to the grassroots revolutionary committees in different neighborhoods and so on. And they managed to actually to bring all this together and sustain, the movement, and also be responsible for it. Because if there isn't a responsibility, then different terrible things can be organized or instigated in the name of the movement. So people have been talking about violence, right? We don't want violence. But what if violence happens? Who is going to say that, well, this was not us, this is not, the movement's responsibility? So at some point, I think the movement should express its to get embodied in some kind of a tangible and credible organization. And this is, of course, the movement side. And for the sake of sustainability, but also in terms of becoming an alternative, becoming a tangible alternative that people should be able to say, okay, this, I like this, to be able to point to something. We don't have this yet. I think somehow it should be built.
Some of the audience members are asking about two things. I'm just going to combine them since we're running out of time. But one is this person asked that you mentioned, you argued before that there was very little contagion effect between the Iran's 2009 uprising and the Arab Spring movements that came afterwards. Does it look different at this time than that argument from then? And then another question is that what role, positive or negative, can the so-called Iranian political opposition leaders in the West play in what is going on in Iran, as well as the question of what role can or do Western governments play in this uprising?
I think these international questions with international relations, maybe I leave it to Vali to and you to respond what role they can play. But what I can say is, of course, as I said, revolutions are by nature international because it's big, right? And I think Iranian situation is very interesting in the sense that Iran seems to be so isolated and it doesn't have like Western allies. And so this has, of course, both sides, right? In other words, because it doesn't have a Western ally, then Western countries cannot, as such, put the kind of pressure on the Iranian regime as they could on, say, Mubarak or Saudi Arabia and so forth. They couldn't just pick up a phone saying, well, maybe you should behave that way or that way. So this cannot really happen. And so that's kind of makes, in some way, the Iranian regime somewhat more immune, yeah? But at the same time, Iranian regime perhaps, having an ally also could work against a revolution, yeah? Depends upon the nature of the state, right? And that is constraint that maybe opposition Saudi Arabia would feel, or in Bahrain, for instance, yeah? So in this sense, therefore, it is an advantage for the opposition. As for the first question, yeah, I think Arab Spring was very Arab in many ways, in the sense that because of the common language and familiar, somewhat political culture, the repertoire and the slogans and the sentiments could travel very easily across borders. And I don't think that necessarily it really crossed the border of Iran at the time, yeah. Although I think a lot of perhaps Iranians were following, but this language, I think, difference made an important, it was a barrier in some way for the contagion. These days, what is happening in Iran, I feel that at least among my own Arab friends, a lot of them follow very closely, interestingly, because they have had certain experiences, and they want to see what the Iranian model can perhaps offer for them. In this sense, I think is a healthy and very positive, I think, development. In particular, when at the top there are collaboration and cooperation between Iran and Iraq and Yemen or Syria and so on, and that cooperation and solidarity and collaboration at the civil society level, at the movements level in the region hasn't really taken place, to my knowledge. And I think that's a very interesting moment that perhaps some changes are happening in this direction.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I wish we could continue this conversation for at least another hour. I know there's so much to explore, but we really appreciate your time and your willingness to talk in the process as things are changing. I know it's not the easiest thing to do. So we really appreciate you being willing to go there with us, to conceptualize, to theorize, and to help us think through all of this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you.